So those nutrients, if we're supplementing 0.5% of body weight, 1% of body weight, a lot of those nutrients are directly reapplied through manure. So can we reduce fertility in those pastures by accounting for the nutrients in that supplement as it goes through the animal, even on a growing animal? So we're using steers, we're backgrounding them, so growing animals that would actually retain more nutrients than, say, cow calf. That's the model we chose at this point.
Welcome to the Feed Science Podcast. I'm your host today, Adam Fahrenholz, coming to you from North Carolina State University's Animal Food Manufacturing Program. We're updating the name, folks, so I have a hard time remembering what exactly it is that we're calling ourselves these days. On behalf of Wisenetics, I'd like to welcome our guest today. Our guest is Dr. Leanne Dillard. Leanne is an associate professor in pasture-based ruminant nutrition at Auburn University. Leanne, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for joining the podcast.
I'm excited to be here.
You bet. As we normally do, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself to the audience and talk about kind of your journey and your path to, how you got sitting in the chair you're sitting in today.
Yeah. So my current position, I am an extension specialist that covers the whole state of Alabama on pastures and forages, which technically covers all species, but I have a ruminant nutrition background, so I focus on beef cattle. But before, I actually grew up in Northwest Georgia on a poultry farm. So I grew up on a broiler farm and had a few cattle, but got into ag that way since a young age. Went to college, and I always laugh. I tell people that I was become kind of anti-ag in the fact that I got tired of waking up at 6 a.m. every morning, dumping chickens before school started. So I actually went into biology as an undergrad, but learned in my degree in biology that ag is an ecological system, just like any other biological system, and it has its own nuances that are really cool. And I had a really unique perspective on that. So then I went to Where Better Than Cow College, which is what we call Auburn University, to study the pasture system and ecology of a pasture system and how raising cattle and producing that beef or milk and the inputs we put into it affect that system, but also the surrounding systems and how to make that more sustainable, both economically, but also environmentally. So I actually went to Auburn for graduate school. I went to Georgia and Penn State for postdocs before making it back to Auburn about 7 years ago when I was hired as extension specialist. So it's kind of given me a unique perspective on how we kind of integrate modern agriculture on the beef cattle side.
Eastman serves veterinarians and nutritionists in agrochemical and animal health industries by helping them select, evaluate, and implement innovative nutritional programs. Eastman works with your team to customize your gut health approach in feed and water. Eastman's approach addresses nutritional and bacterial challenges and finds new ingredient preservation and hygiene solutions. Explore ways to accelerate and innovate your programs. Contact the animal nutrition team at eastman.com.
Sure. So is that then generally what most of your research extension teaching work focuses on, is that integration then of all of the different aspects of especially the pasture-based cattle systems?
Yeah, definitely. So since I've been back at Auburn, my research has focused on the integration of row crops and basically diversification of ag systems. So a big part of my research has looked at the reintegration of livestock into row crop farming. Row crops in Alabama are really big and an important part of our economy. But what we've learned over the last about 40 years since we've diversified farms is that livestock and grazing had an important part in renewing the soil and making the soil more productive so those crops are more productive. So we're looking at ways to strategically incorporate grazing cattle or other animals into those systems to not only benefit the cattle, diversify income, but also, actually promote better crop production. We're also doing this on the livestock side and looking at how integrating different, poultry, for example, is pretty contained system versus cattle and how those two systems can work better together to increase the sustainability of those systems because they're really important to the economy, the entire Southeast, right? And we have to find a way of using those different products together to help the farmers keep farming.
So I definitely want to touch base on some of what you just mentioned about integrating the poultry and integrating the row crop farming. let's start first talking about, because we are the Feed Science podcast. Let's start first talking about, why is it important that there is a level of communication, even when we are talking about a pasture-based system, between the producer, the rancher, grower, farmer, whatever we want to call them, depending on what else they're also doing, and the folks that would be providing any supplementation that they need when it comes to, doing a pasture based system. Because in most cases, to my understanding, and being a kid grew up in the Midwest and in Kansas, there are some cases where, yeah, they can just kind of go out on grass and be fine, but in most cases we got to give them a little something extra if we want to get them there. So how does that communication need to work in order to be the most effective?
Yeah, so, a lot of my students, as I train them, and several of my students are now in the feed industry, because what we have found is that, you know, pastures are great, but pastures, even in Alabama, do not grow year round. We do have to supplement, be it hay, or some kind of feed product. And it's important to know, we always tell our producers, you need to know what you have, be it hay or pasture, so that you can fine tune your supplementation. Feed ingredients are expensive, and different feed ingredients provide different things. Protein supplements, for example, are really commonly used throughout the winter, but a lot of times it's actually energy that ends up being what's affecting that animal production. That's on the cow calf side, which is what we see a lot in the southeast, right? Usually just in the winter. But if you're looking at the niche markets of, that grass fed, or those, homesteaders that want to finish out their own cattle, unfortunately, we can't finish out cattle in a reasonable amount of time on pasture in the southeast.
Right.
Our forages really just don't support that. We can get good gains most of the time, but not quite finish them. So it's important to, talk with the goals, your what your goals of your farm are, with your feed partners, so that you know what you're buying, because it may be protein that you need, it may be energy. And that's really going to affect the way, what weight your animal finishes out, the quality of that meat, any flavors, right? We are what we eat. That's the same for cows. So, what you feed them can also affect the flavor of that meat, which, if you're selling that, then that's an important factor for your consumer. So, you as well.
Yeah. So there does need to be that, the producer coming to whoever they're getting their supplement from
Mhm.
and saying, this is what I have and this is where I want to get. And then it's equally important for those that are on the side of perhaps producing that supplement, knowing which tools they can put in place, whether that be ingredients or processing, whatever, to meet those goals of the producer they're trying to supply to.
That's right. And we definitely see a trend. I mentioned my graduate students earlier, that, like I said, most my students are mostly trained in forage quality, a little bit of supplementation, but on pasture management. And we've seen a trend among a lot of the large feed manufacturers, that they're hiring people with forage backgrounds, so that they can kind of fine tune that and talk with producers about their goals, because it's not just one product fits the bill for all producers. It's very, very different, so that they can kind of help bridge that and help educate the producers too. Because sometimes producers don't, they kind of have a goal, but they're not sure how to get there. So we're seeing that partnership among the feed industry, as well as an extension throughout the Southeast, and I would say throughout the country, of making that connection, that understanding your forage is very important to understanding your supplementation, and how different feed products and how they're manufactured would affect that animal performance overall.
Sure, sure. So do you see specific differences in maybe kind of how some of that relationship works? And it could be, like you said, supplementation of feed stuff, something manufactured, or even hay. How does that change as you have these different levels of integration of, I've just got a cattle farm versus I do some row cropping in cattle versus I got a multi-species farm? How has, what are I'm assuming, especially with what your research is focused on, what are some of the advantages of these more integrated systems on the farm, as far as what they do or do not need from maybe something like supplementation?
So I would say the most uh, obvious one, the biggest one we use, is the integration of the poultry industry with beef cattle. So for any of you familiar with poultry, it's a huge uh, market here in Alabama, the largest livestock industry we have here in the state, and that's true for many states in the southeast. But there are a lot of byproducts that come out of that. The number one probably being poultry litter. Now, with the advances in the poultry industry compared to when I was a kid and grew up on a poultry farm and we were cleaning out twice a year, now they may only clean out every couple of years. So the availability of poultry litter is different. The poultry litter itself is different, but it's still a product in which turns out is a great fertilizer. So that is a product that can be, we need something to do with it. Land application of a lot of that stuff is the best way to do it because those nutrients can be reused by the plants. And what's great about that is we grow those pasture forages, and then that provides feed for our cattle, which gives us that diversified market. So you find that quite frequently, people that have poultry also have cattle, or they're in areas of high cattle density, so they can get rid of that. Um, Another way, kind of unique, that we have been doing over the last couple of years, we have a project focusing on this right now. Dr. Smith, Brandon Smith, my counterpart here in the department, and I've been partnered on a project that we're calling Feed Through Fertilization. So, or excuse me, fertilization through feed. It's the opposite. So the idea of, supplementation, nutrients are getting expensive, whether you're looking at fertilizer or you're looking at supplementation. And we know that an animal typically only uses only use about 10 to 20% of those nutrients. A lot of that passes directly through. Just like the reason poultry litter ends up having high nutrients is because a lot of that passes through the broiler. Same is true for the cattle. So those nutrients, if we're supplementing 0.5% of body weight, 1% of body weight, a lot of those nutrients are directly reapplied through manure. So can we reduce fertility in those pastures by accounting for the nutrients in that supplement as it goes through the animal, even on a growing animal? So we're using steers, we're backgrounding them, so growing animals that would actually retain more nutrients than, say, cow calf. That's the model we chose at this point, just to look at that. And what we've seen is, compared to pastures that are traditionally fertilized and cattle that have no supplementation, the growth on those animals is a little bit slower, for one, because they're not able to push themselves a little bit on the weight gain side. But then also the pasture production has been lower because there's not any added nutrients to that system. All we're doing is recycling what's already there. So I think that's kind of the future integration as we move forward, is looking at, even within one animal species, can we strategically supplement with nitrogen and phosphorus, promote that growth? And it's cheaper to give, instead of 0.5% of body weight, maybe 1% of body weight. Maybe that's a little bit more than they need in that system, but all that return can then go in our pasture.
Okay.
So kind of a unique way of looking at it, but kind of where the future is in terms of looking at this integration.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm following you. That's all very interesting. Once again, my guest today is Leanne Dillard. Leanne is an associate professor in pasture-based ruminant nutrition at Auburn University. Following up on that, where do things like, obviously we've got a mindset around sustainability and land usage and these kinds of things today. Where does things like integrating cattle and poultry, or integrating cattle and row crops, where does that benefit potentially us on some of those concerns about being more sustainable, being, better stewards of the land? Hey, there's only so much land to go around. Can we get more out of the same amount of land than we otherwise could? I'm assuming there's probably some ways to pick up some advantage there.
Definitely. So I'll do row crop integration first. So one thing we found is if you're in row crops, cover crops, or we've been promoting them for 30 or 40 years as important things for sustainability on the environmental side, to not have that land fallow. What we found, though, is producers, they have to pay for seed, they have to pay for fertilizer for those cover crops, and there's no direct return. Now, yes, we know that you increase soil health, which can help promote uh, crop production. Usually we see a break in disease cycles, but there's no direct benefit. So by integrating that system, which is already more sustainable with cattle, then we're able to see a direct economic benefit of those cover crops. Now, one thing that we have kind of been looking at is, how do we maintain that sustainability? Obviously, we don't want to graze those cover crops into the ground, because then we've created a fallow system, just like before. But we've been playing with, basically, how long is our grazing window here in Alabama, to make sure we still have enough cover to promote that we can terminate and reduce weed competitions. That's one of our goals with our cover crops, and enough root production, but also enough grazing days, because, as you know, you need at least 30, 45 days of grazing window to really see an economic benefit in the cattle gains. So that's one way that we've been promoting sustainability, by integrating the system, because it makes it more feasible for the producer to, on the economic side, to put in cover crops when they know that they're going to be able to get something out of it, be it partnering with a neighbor and doing contract grazing, or they have cattle themselves and they're going to be selling those gains. On the poultry side, one of the negatives that we've seen here in Alabama over the many years of poultry production is the high phosphorus.
Hmm.
We all know that grains have a lot of phosphorus in them, and poultry aren't great at getting that out. So poultry litter has more phosphorus in it than phosphorus and nitrogen is about the same, but the plant needs are very different. So a lot of that phosphorus ends up being in the ground. The good thing from that is phosphorus is not water soluble. So typically it stays there unless we have some type of um, event where we'd have soil erosion. And that's where pastures are great. Benefits to this is because usually pastures are not disturbed, right? They're going to be perennial systems. They're going to go into that
Mm.
system and they can kind of be a sink for some of that phosphorus. On top of that, many of our forages are actually able to remediate the soil. So a lot of my PhD work actually looked at removing phosphorus in a grazing system through using Bermuda grass and tall fescue, which are really known to collect that. So I think that also helps us integrate that. Other options for poultry that we really don't have a lot, and that's a waste product that, if it built up, might reduce the poultry industry in this region. We have to have some
Right.
source of it. So pastures become a really sustainable way of us doing that, without causing any environmental harm with all that phosphorus. So I think that's a system that works really well, and we've shown over the decades it's a very sustainable system. And you're able to basically reduce any synthetic fertilizer needs in those pasture systems by doing that. So
Okay. So it sounds to me like there's definitely some possibilities here of, okay, we feed the phosphorus to the poultry. We've been, for the same reason, we hear about that a lot. We've decreased the amount of phosphorus, which is expensive and has to be mined and everything else in poultry, both because it can be a problem from a land application standpoint, also because we now have phytase enzymes and everything else that help, use all the available phosphorus that's there. But then in theory, if we do land apply it and it goes into some of the pasture grasses and whatnot that the cattle eat, that would also in theory then mean, based on the quality of their forage, they are, I'm assuming, a little less likely to themselves need any kind of phosphorus
yes,
supplementation. So I'm not having to go get a feed stuff, a supplement, or a mineral block that's real high in phosphorus, because
that's right.
lo and behold, my grasses have more phosphorus in them because I'm land applying. So at least I'm getting a good life cycle out of that phosphorus.
And it's not perfectly efficient system, but when you think about it in terms of the whole cycle,
Sure.
we're taking grains with phosphorus from the Midwest, bringing them to the Southeast, and that's where that phosphorus is coming from, right? We're
Yep.
giving them to the cattle. Then we send the cattle back to the Midwest or to the West, and then that manure from those feedlots is then applied to row crops. So, in we kind of have a system, like I said, it's not perfectly efficient, but where we are trying to move that phosphorus around, and I think that's something that we all know, both from the supplement and the fertilizer side. There's only a limited supply of phosphorus. It is very expensive, and I think that's something that from both sides of the industry that we are working on trying to perfect, so that we can kind of make more of a closed cycle to help both all parts of the industry work better. And also, the great thing is, almost all, at least in my experience, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability go in hand in
Yep.
hand. It makes things really nice when you're like, not only can it save you money, but it's good for the environment. Because, and I grew up, I'm a farmer's daughter. I understand that if it doesn't make money sense, then that's not going to be a practice we're going to adopt.
Right.
So with our extension program, we really try to hone in on the economics to show that, hey, first and foremost, this is either not going to cost you anything or actually make you more money. An added benefit is that, hey, it's going to be good for the environment, which means long term that you're actually making things better for yourself, even though sometimes that's a little hard to wrap your head around 20, 30 years from now, what that might look like. That's why, we always say our ag guys, they're great stewards of the land, because even though they're thinking the economics, we're really lucky in that usually those decisions come hand in hand, which makes it even better on, then you can tie in the social sustainability from that perspective as well.
Yep. There been any significant works of looking at, I'm thinking especially being that I sit here in the Prestige Department of Poultry Science, and though I'm a glorified feed miller, I have to think poultry as much as I can sometimes, right? Um, have there been much look as far as these integrated systems, how different feeding strategies of the poultry impact the litter, that then impacts the integration success? And or I know we've also done a lot of work over the years, or not we, others have done a lot of work over the years at like different litter types, using shavings versus miscanthus grass versus whatever. Are those things that also get looked at as far as their success and their impact on the land application, and then how that's impacting pasture, row crops, things like that?
Definitely. And so, and you mentioned, I think the one that really changed the game, which was the use of phytase.
Yeah.
I think that really affected because in the soil, there are a lot of different microbes that can make all of that available to phytases in the soil. So I think that was a big game changer. And I think that technology has really changed both how the swine and poultry industry have their effluent or litter has, been integrated, which has been a huge benefit. I would say there has been a little bit of work on the carbon source, which would be either the pine shavings or the miscanthus, because a lot of that is local though. It's what you can get the cheapest, right? Is whatever your carbon
Right.
source
Right.
is.
Yep.
There's not as many as comparisons, but from my experience, another big factor, and it's not even from the feeding side, it's the poultry treatment. So the use of ammonia capturing chemicals in the poultry we have a researcher here, his name's Dr. Rishi Prasad, who's been working at how some of those different enzymes that are used to reduce ammonia are
Hmm.
actually allowing us to capture more nitrogen, right? Because it's not volatilizing,
Yeah.
which is helping. So we're using phytase, which is reducing the phosphorus. We're capturing more nitrogen because less ammonia volatilization, which is actually making the poultry litter more in line with what the plants need. Which so I think maybe in the next 20 years, with the huge advancements in the poultry industry, right? It's very different than it was when I was a kid, the 90s. But I think we're going to have a product that's even more in line with what we need, and maybe hopefully have less concerns with phosphorus accumulating in our soils and our poultry concentrated areas.
Yeah, that's all really interesting, and hopefully, people listening, especially if they're coming from the feed side, the nutrition side, think about, okay, you're making feed, or you're designing feed to feed this, and in this case, poultry.
Mhm.
It's going to have an impact downstream, 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 downstream. Perhaps two, three, even four steps of
That's right.
what was successfully done here, and some of the reasons why a formulation change might come is, like you said, it's usually going to have the most to do with the economics of the
Mhm.
exact next step. But in theory, if we look at this as more of a large data problem, we may actually be making some decisions based on, well, I would like my litter to have this, and for my litter to have this, I need to feed the chickens this way
That's
so
right.
that I can then apply the litter downstream. And if doing that's going to cost me a bunch of money on the chickens, then I'm not obviously going to do it.
That's right.
But if I can still be profitable and do that, then that's a win-win for everybody. And I think it's fun to think about these in these like large system ideas.
And I think that that's becoming more the norm. Not to call myself old, but back when I was trained, everyone was kind of in their own box. Also here at
Hmm.
Auburn, we have a separate poultry science department. We have a biosystems department that's doing a lot of work with litter, and also the mechanization of the poultry house. A huge thing on all sides, right, was the humidity control. That's totally changed the game of the quality of the litter too, right? So,
Right.
but now we're seeing that whatever reason there's fewer of us, or just because we see the big picture, we're all starting to work together and making those linkages. Because when we have conversations, it's kind of interesting. They're like, well, we were thinking about do making this change, and then I can kind of think couple down some, I'm like, oh well, that'd be great. Like,
Yeah.
y'all do it, y'all look at that technology, because then that's going to have this benefit. Or we can try to see, okay, well, that technology, while good on this part of the cycle, may be detrimental to this part. So is there a different way we can look at that? So I think that's something that we're seeing more and more of, faculty coming together, researchers. And like I said earlier, even partnering with the industry. I'm much more well connected with the industry now than I feel like I was as a student, because the industry is starting to recognize that forages are a big part of beef cattle, right? Or
Right.
horses, even. And that's important to understand when you're talking about what that animal needs on top of that. Because one, the producers can't spend all the money on the extra nutrients they don't need. And two, we all really understand that, we are stewards of this land. And as agriculturalists, we should do our best to make sure what we're doing is protecting that for the future. Otherwise, agriculture won't be here anymore, right?
Absolutely. I think that's very, very well said. And to your point about, working together with everybody, it makes it more fun kind of doing some of that. And I'm sure your administration there at Auburn's no different than ours. They like things that are interdisciplinary and collaborative, right? That's a checkbox real good.
That's
So the
right.
more that everybody wants to do that, that's better. So
It's time for our famous three.
well, I very much appreciated our conversation. We always like to close with a few kind of general questions for folks. The first one's a little bit more specific to our conversation, I suppose, in that if people want to learn more about this topic, what would be some good places that you would suggest they could go and look for information, particular publications, newsletters, websites, things like that really get into this kind of information?
Perfect. So our two main websites, which are managed by myself and our beef cattle extension specialist, would be alabamaforages.com and alabamabeefsystems.com. So those are our extension websites, but we also put summaries of all of our research and try to put all that out. And those would be two real quick resources that I would encourage you to check out to look at the kinds of things we're doing here in Alabama, or more generally, just our aces.edu, which is our Alabama
Mhm.
Cooperative Extension website. And Dr. Prasad is also an extension specialist. And we also bring just our research and teaching faculty in as well to do summaries on their research. And we try to keep that a good place for those resources. So
Awesome. Perfect. As far as maybe more of a general sense, when you think about resources that you found really useful as kind of like building your career, or it could even be something like, there was a book I really read, or something I subscribed to, or an organization that I'm a part of that you think, okay, that's really shaped some of what I've done and helped with my success. For any of those, potentially up and coming academics or graduate students, or even folks that are out in the industry and working and that say, yep, professional development is something I'm really concerned about. Any thoughts on that, on things that you would often share with people to say, hey, this is something you might want to look at or read, or that sort of thing?
I will say, and I'm going to say that my membership in the American Society of Animal Science has been pivotal. And part of that was what I did with it. So as a graduate student, I was the first graduate student director of the Southern ASAS board.
Perfect.
And I can't even tell you what we did, but I can tell you I was able to sit in a room with full professors from across the Southeast and got to know them. And I've been friends with them my entire career, and they've served as great mentors. So getting in an organization, trying to get a leadership role and partnering with some of those professors, assistants, so whatever level they are, those are your mentors for life. So, and my mentors have been a huge part of my success in my career.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic suggestion, and I think it's you took it to another step. My one of my previous PhD students, she did the same. She in Poultry Science Association, and she threw her name in the hat to go be a student director, and it made a world of difference. So it's not just about, hey, it's free because I'm a student. I'll go ahead and do the membership, and I'll show up at the meeting, and I'll sit in on the presentations, and we'll go over here to the barbecue. It's no, take the time to potentially get into a leadership. I'll serve on that committee, that sort of thing,
Yeah,
because
engage.
you're going to learn some things just through the engagement, but the people you get to know are potentially huge. And I think that's we've had a number of folks say,
Yes.
I joined this organization, but I think that point of it's not just about joining it, it's about being a part of it that probably makes the biggest difference.
And I will say that, I've encouraged my students to do the same thing, and they have the same experiences, because what you learn is those faculty are just people, right?
Yeah.
They're just people. And it's great. Like I said, those faculty, I still interact on a regular basis with most of them, and now I get to call them up and, hey, do you want to collaborate on this grant? So definitely, get connected in some way in your professional organization.
All right, then the last question then is, as you've worked with a number of different professionals in a number of different spaces kind of throughout your career, what would you say are one or two of the like primary characteristics that you've seen in the people that you've worked with that you've said, okay, that person's particularly successful in their realm, and we've had folks, make sure that I don't get too stuck in the, professional realm. But hey, I really appreciated the way they were able to achieve this balance, or the way they were able to lead these people, or whatever. What are some of the things, or maybe pick one thing it's like, yes, that's something that I've always appreciated about the people that I've found the most respect for.
The first word that comes to mind is flexibility. Probably not is the best word to describe this, But what I've discovered, and one thing I try to emulate, is not to try to put yourself in a box or put others in a box. And sometimes compromise is hard. We're all very stubborn people, but understanding that there's more than one way of doing something. Your way is not the only way. It's not necessarily even the most right way. And the leaders that I see throughout in my personal and professional life are people that, when respected other people's differences, were willing to listen, and then use flexibility to say, hey, there's a different way we can do this, let's try that, and weren't afraid to do that. People who are a little bit more dictators in the way they do things, tend to cause some animosity. So that's one thing that I try to remember, is that not to put myself in a box. I always tell my students, leave as many doors open as possible. Try not to
That's
shut
right.
any doors as you go through your career. Show respect for everyone, even in professional disagreements. But really, I would summarize it maybe as flexibility, is just showing, hey, like I can, because sometimes doors get shut and you kind of have to weave and go down a different path. But that's surely a bad thing, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's a really good lesson for whether they be graduate students or undergraduate students or young professionals in their career, academic industry, wherever they are. A lot of the people that they will tend to, or any of us have tended to look up to, are going to be later in their career, and they're maybe not all that flexible at that point. And it's like, yeah, because after 25, 30 years, they have developed, this is my thing
That's right.
and this is what I do.
Yeah,
But if you can go ask them, and you ask them what their first 10 years of their career are like, oh, they're like, oh, I had no idea I was going to be here.
that's right.
I was doing a little of this, a little of this, little of this, and this became my path. And getting people to understand that from the jump is really hard.
Yeah, it is. And I will say, I did not plan to be an extension specialist. I didn't want to work with producers because they intimidated me. I wanted to teach.
Right.
I taught for one semester as an adjunct faculty, and I was like, oh no, that I'm not a good teacher. I don't enjoy it.
Those students are intimidating too.
Yes, yes, they are more so. So then I work for an extension specialist. Like, there's my job. So I always tell, students who are early career, as you go through, don't shut down an opportunity just because you think, if you've never experienced it, you don't know if you're going to like it or not. So always keep an open mind, and be flexible, because you just never know what excitement will be on the journey next, right?
That's a great way to end it. Again, my guest today has been Leanne Dillard. Leanne is an associate professor at Auburn University working in the space of pasture-based ruminant nutrition. Leanne, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Again, I'm Adam Farnolls, coming to you from North Carolina State University on behalf of Wise Genetics. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.